The ship screamed through the atmosphere, trailing fire like a comet with a death wish. Inside the rapidly heating cockpit, Lieutenant Marcus Daniels fought the controls with bloodied hands, his military training the only thing keeping absolute panic at bay. "Come on, you piece of..." The rest of his curse was drowned out by the explosion of his port stabilizer. Through the cracked viewscreen, an alien landscape rushed up to meet him, vast purple forests and silver plains under twin moons. Not how I plan to discover new worlds, he thought grimly, bracing for impact. The crash was violence and noise and then, nothing. When consciousness returned, it arrived in fragments, the copper taste of blood, the hiss of ruptured coolant lines, and pain. So much pain. Marcus dragged himself from the wreckage, survival kit clutched to his chest like a lifeline. The ship, his home for the past 3 years, was now a smoking crater in the strange earth. 3 days passed in a blur of fever and thirst. His emergency beacon chirped faithfully into the void, but the Orion fleet was likely weeks away at best, assuming the signal penetrated the planet's unusual magnetic field. He'd catalogued what he could of his surroundings: breathable air, drinkable water, no immediate predators, when the fever took hold completely. He was delirious when she found him. At first, he thought she was a hallucination, tall and graceful with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes like liquid silver. Too human to be alien, too alien to be human. She knelt beside him, pressing something cool to his forehead. "You're burning up, Ren," she said, her voice melodic but tinged with worry. "What happened to your ship?" Marcus blinked, the fever making it hard to focus. "Not Ren," he managed. "Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, Orion Fleet." The alien woman tilted her head, confusion crossing her features. "Your body may be different, but I would know your soul anywhere, Ren." "It's me, Talia." "We've never met," he insisted weakly, even as something tugged at the edges of his consciousness, a half-remembered dream, perhaps, or déjà vu so strong it made him dizzy. Talia smiled, a gesture somehow both familiar and foreign. "The journey must have confused you. Come, our settlement is nearby. We need to heal you." Too weak to protest, Marcus allowed her to help him to his feet. She was surprisingly strong, supporting his weight easily as they moved through the purple forest. Delicate luminescent particles floated around them, responding to their movement like curious fireflies. "The lumen welcome you back," she said softly, gesturing to the lights. "They remember you." "I've never been here before," Marcus insisted, though with less conviction than before. Talia led him to a settlement nestled between massive trees with trunks wider than buildings. The structures blended seamlessly with the natural environment, homes grown rather than built, with soft blue light emanating from within. The inhabitants paused in their activities to watch them pass, their expressions ranging from surprise to joy to deep confusion. "Ren returns," called an older male, his face lined with age but his silver eyes bright. "Not as we knew him," Talia responded cryptically. They brought him to a dwelling at the settlement's edge, where Talia laid him on a bed that seemed to conform perfectly to his body. She mixed something in a stone bowl, herbs with a sharp, clean scent, and spread the paste over his wounds. "Your body is different," she murmured, her fingers tracing the military tattoo on his shoulder. "But here," she placed her hand over his heart, the touch sending an unexpected jolt through him, "you are the same." "I don't understand," Marcus said, fighting to stay conscious. "How do you speak my language? How do you know this?" "Ren?" Talia's expression softened. "Sleep now. There will be time for explanations." As darkness claimed him, Marcus felt her lips press against his forehead in a gesture so tender and familiar that for just a moment, he almost remembered returning it countless times before. His last thought before unconsciousness took him was that her touch felt like coming home, a home he'd never known he had. Marcus awoke to unfamiliar birdsong and the scent of something sweet cooking nearby. For a moment, he lay still, cataloguing his surroundings like the soldier he was. The fever had broken, and his wounds had been dressed with some kind of translucent film that seemed to breathe with his skin. "You're finally awake," Talia said, entering with a steaming bowl. "You've been drifting in and out for 3 days." Marcus pushed himself up, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. 3 days? I need to check my beacon. Your device is safe, she assured him, sitting beside him on the bed. Though I doubt it will bring your people here. The veil around our world obscures it from most sensors. She offered him the bowl. Inside was a luminous blue porridge that smelled like cinnamon and sea salt. Marcus hesitated before taking a cautious spoonful. It tasted like memory, childhood breakfasts he'd never had, comfort he'd never known. "This is impossible," he murmured. "How do you know how to make food compatible with my biology?" Talia's silver eyes studied him with a mixture of patience and sadness. "Because I've made it for you hundreds of times before, Ren. My name is Marcus," he insisted, though the conviction in his voice wavered. "Come," she said, standing. "There's something you should see." She led him through the settlement, which buzzed with activity in the morning light. The inhabitants, the Lasari, as Talia called them, paused to greet them, many embracing Marcus with the warmth reserved for a long-lost friend. He noticed they all had the same copper skin and silver eyes as Talia, though their heights and builds varied considerably. They arrived at a structure larger than the others, its walls adorned with what appeared to be a living mural of shifting scenes. "This is our memory hall," Talia explained. "Where we preserve important events in our collective history." She placed her hand on one section of the wall, and the images responded, coalescing into a scene that stole Marcus's breath. There, rendered in perfect detail, was a man who could have been his twin, but with subtle differences. His hair was longer, his face less weathered by military service, his stance relaxed in a way Marcus had never known. And beside this doppelganger stood Talia, their fingers intertwined, their bodies leaning toward each other with the easy intimacy of longtime lovers. "That's not possible," Marcus whispered, reaching out to touch the image before pulling back. "5 cycles ago, Ren came to us," Talia said softly. "His ship crashed, much like yours. But unlike you, he had no desire to return to the stars. He stayed, learned our ways, became one of us." Her voice caught. "We were to be joined in the spring ceremony, but 3 moons ago, he ventured into the outer wilds and never returned." Marcus felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm not him. I have a life, a duty, waiting for me back home." "Of course," Talia said, her expression carefully neutral. "And we will help you contact your people, if that's what you truly want." Over the next few days, Marcus divided his time between working on the ship's communications array and learning about the Lasari. Despite his protestations, he found himself drawn to their way of life, their harmony with the living world around them, their lack of hierarchy, their open expressions of emotion so different from the stoic military environment he'd known. And he found himself drawn to Talia. She never pressed the issue of his identity, but sometimes he caught her watching him with a look of such profound recognition that it shook him to his core. One evening, as they walked along a river that glowed with bioluminescent algae, their hands brushed accidentally. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him that was both foreign and achingly familiar. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling away. "For what?" Talia asked, her silver eyes reflecting the river's glow. "This must be difficult for you, seeing someone who looks like the man you loved, but isn't him." Talia studied him for a long moment. "The body is just a vessel, Marcus. What I loved in Ren exists in you too, I can sense it. The way you pause before speaking to gather your thoughts, how you always touch the scar on your wrist when you're anxious, even the way you look at the stars with both longing and fear." Marcus froze. He did have a nervous habit of touching his wrist, where a childhood injury had left a small crescent-shaped scar. But he'd never mentioned this to Talia, and it would have been impossible for her to know this about Ren. "That's just coincidence," he said, but uncertainty colored his voice. Talia took his hand gently, turning it to reveal the scar. With deliberate slowness, she traced it with her finger, then raised his wrist to her lips, pressing a kiss to the marked skin. The gesture was so intimate, so familiar, that Marcus couldn't bring himself to pull away. "Perhaps," she whispered against his skin. "Or perhaps there are mysteries in this universe beyond what either of our peoples understand." That night, as Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling of Talia's dwelling, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting within him, as if the boundaries of his identity were becoming fluid, merging with something else, someone else. For the first time since the crash, he wasn't sure if rescue was what he truly wanted. His last thought before drifting into sleep was of Talia's lips on his wrist, and how much he wanted to feel them elsewhere. The dream came with startling clarity. Marcus stood on a cliff overlooking a vast purple forest, but he wasn't alone. Talia was beside him, her hand in his, teaching him the names of the distant mountains. He could feel the warmth of the 3 suns on his face, taste the sweetness of the air, and understand the complex harmonies of the Lasari language falling from his own lips. "The western range will be difficult to cross," he heard himself say, though the voice felt both his and not his. "But the crystal caves beyond will be worth the journey." "Always seeking the next horizon, Ren," Talia laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. He turned to her, cupping her face with a tenderness he had never shown anyone. "Only because you gave me a reason to explore beyond the stars." Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home. Marcus jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. Dawn was just breaking, casting long shadows across the floor of his room in Talia's dwelling. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to dismiss the dream, but it clung to him like a second skin. The sensations had been too real, too detailed to be mere fantasy. He rose quietly and made his way to the communication array he'd been repairing. Work would clear his head. It always had. 3 hours of soldering and reconfiguring later, he was no closer to peace than when he'd started. The dream wouldn't fade as dreams should. "You look troubled," came Talia's voice from behind him. She approached with 2 cups of steaming liquid that smelled of herbs and honey. Marcus accepted one gratefully. "Bad dreams," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Or perhaps good ones you're afraid to acknowledge," she suggested, sitting beside him. "Your soul remembers, even if your mind resists." He set down his tools with a sigh. "I dreamed we were standing on a cliff. You were teaching me the names of mountains." "We were." He trailed off, unable to say the word lovers aloud. Talia's eyes widened. "The Ascension Cliffs. That was where Ren first told me he would stay on Lasseria." "Where we first," she stopped herself, a flush darkening her copper skin. Marcus felt heat rise in his own cheeks. "This is impossible. I've never been to those cliffs. I've never seen those mountains." "And yet you dreamed of them in detail," she said softly. "There is a phenomenon among my people called echo souls. Our elders teach that when souls are deeply connected, they can resonate across different vessels, different lives, even across the stars. You're suggesting Ren and I are the same person?" "That's not exactly the same," she interrupted. "More like echoes of each other. Different expressions of the same essential energy." Marcus ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Even if I believe that, and I'm not saying I do, what does it mean? I still have a life waiting for me. Responsibilities. People who depend on me." "It means nothing has to be decided now," Talia said, placing her hand on his. The contact sent another jolt through him, desire mixed with recognition. "But perhaps you could allow yourself to explore the possibility." That afternoon, at Talia's suggestion, they visited the settlement's elder, Norin, who had been a mentor to Ren. The ancient Lasari sat cross-legged in a garden of singing flowers, his silver eyes clouded with age but still piercing. The soldier returns with a different face, Norrin observed, studying Marcus. Yet the essence remains. I'm not him, Marcus said, but the protest had lost its edge. Perhaps, perhaps not, Norrin replied enigmatically. The universe does not always conform to our neat categories. May I? He gestured toward Marcus's forehead. After a hesitant nod from Talia, Marcus agreed. The elder's cool fingertips pressed against his temples, and suddenly images flooded his mind, navigating the bioluminescent rivers by night, learning to communicate with the lumen lights, harvesting crystal fruits from the highest branches, and Talia, always Talia, her body entwined with his under alien stars, her lips tracing patterns on his skin, teaching him pleasures his military life had never allowed him to imagine. Marcus gasped and pulled away, overwhelmed by the intensity of the visions. Those weren't dreams, he whispered. They were memories. Yes, Norrin confirmed. But whether they are memories bleeding through from another life or your own forgotten past is for you to determine. That night, neither Marcus nor Talia spoke much as they prepared a simple meal together. The silence between them was charged with unspoken questions and suppressed desires. As they ate, their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. The repairs on my communication array are almost complete, Marcus said finally. Another day, maybe two. Talia nodded, her expression carefully neutral. And then you will call for your people to rescue you. That was the plan, he admitted. But now He couldn't finish the thought. She rose from the table and came to stand beside him. With deliberate slowness, she took his hand and placed it over her heart. Even through the fabric of her garment, he could feel its rapid beating. This knows you, she said softly. Whatever name you call yourself. Marcus stood, their bodies now inches apart. He was a soldier, trained to make split-second decisions in the heat of battle, yet he found himself frozen, caught between two lives, the one he had lived and the one that seemed to be awakening within him. I don't know who I am anymore, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Then perhaps, Talia suggested, her silver eyes holding his, you should stop trying to decide and simply feel. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met, and unlike in his dream, this was undeniably real, the softness of her mouth, the taste of her, the small sound she made as his arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer. It was both a first kiss and a reunion, strange and familiar all at once. As they broke apart, breathless, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that whatever decision lay ahead of him, nothing would ever be the same. The communication array crackled to life under Marcus's fingers, the familiar hum of military frequencies a jarring reminder of the world he'd left behind. After nearly 2 weeks on Lasseria, he'd finally managed to boost the signal enough to penetrate what Talia called the veil, the planet's unusual electromagnetic field that had kept it hidden from human exploration. Mayday, Mayday. This is Lieutenant Marcus Daniels of the Orion Fleet, ID code Sierra, November, 375. Requesting extraction from uncharted planet at coordinates. He rattled off the calculations he'd made based on star positions, then repeated the message twice more before signing off. Behind him, Talia stood silently, her expression unreadable as she watched him work. Since their kiss 3 nights ago, something had shifted between them, conversations flowed more easily, touches lingered longer, and at night, they'd explored each other's bodies with an intimacy that felt both new and ancient. Yet neither had spoken of what would happen when, if, his signal was received. How long? She asked simply. Marcus ran calculations in his head. If anyone picks up the signal, 3 days minimum. Maybe a week. Depends on who's patrolling this sector. Talia nodded, then extended her hand. Then we still have time. There's somewhere I want to take you. They journeyed for half a day, moving deeper into the forest than Marcus had ventured before. The trees grew taller here, their canopies filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The lumen, those floating luminescent particles, grew thicker around them, responding to their presence like curious children. "They've always been drawn to you," Talia observed as several lumen danced around Marcus's shoulders. Ren spent months learning to communicate with them. Marcus watched as one landed on his outstretched finger, pulsing with gentle blue light. To his surprise, he felt an answering pulse within his mind, a simple greeting, a recognition. I think I understand them," he said, startled. Talia smiled. "Your body may be different, but your soul remembers." They arrived at the base of a massive cliff face as the larger of Lysaria's 2 moons began to rise. A narrow path wound upward, barely visible in the growing darkness. "The Ascension Cliffs," Marcus said without thinking. "From my dream." "Yes," Talia confirmed. "Though you've never been here, at least not in this body." The climb was challenging, but Marcus's military training served him well, and Talia moved with the grace of someone who had made the journey many times before. When they finally reached the summit, Marcus stood transfixed by the view that spread before him. 3 mountain ranges extended into the distance, exactly as he had seen in his dream. The forest below was a sea of purple, punctuated by the glowing settlements of the Lysari. Above, the twin moons cast silver light across the landscape, and the stars, so different from the constellations he knew, glittered like diamonds scattered across black velvet. "I've been here before," he whispered, the certainty settling into his bones like truth. "Many times," Talia said, taking his hand. "This was our place." She led him to a small hollow in the cliff face, a natural shelter lined with soft moss. Inside, protected from the elements, were items that made Marcus's heart constrict: a hand-carved wooden box, a journal filled with writing he somehow recognized as his own though he couldn't read the Lysari script, and a small crystal pendant shaped like a teardrop. "Ren left these here the day he ventured into the outer wilds," Talia explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He said he would return for them, for me." Marcus picked up the pendant, and a shock of recognition surged through him. Without thinking, he pressed it to his lips, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "I gave this to you when the second moon was new," he said, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought. "You cried and said it was too precious." Talia's eyes widened. Those were his exact words. "How could you know?" Instead of answering, Marcus closed the distance between them, drawing her into his arms. Their kiss was hungry, desperate, both seeking answers in the language of touch that words couldn't provide. They sank down onto the moss bed, hands exploring with increasing urgency. "Show me," Marcus whispered against her throat. Show me what he knew, what we were to each other. Talia's silver eyes locked with his as she slowly removed her garments, revealing copper skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Marcus followed suit, his military-honed body a stark contrast to her alien grace. Yet when their naked forms pressed together, the differences seemed to melt away. He found himself knowing exactly how to touch her, where she was most sensitive, what rhythms made her gasp his name, both names, Marcus and Ren, blending together until they became one identity. And she knew his body just as intimately, fingers tracing scars he'd received in battles light years away as if she'd witnessed each wound. Their lovemaking was like remembering a favorite song, the notes familiar even after years of silence. When they finally lay spent in each other's arms, the twin moons had traveled halfway across the night sky. "I don't understand what's happening to me," Marcus admitted, tracing patterns on Talia's back. "These memories, these feelings, they're real. But so is my life in the fleet. My duties, my oath." Talia propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face. "Perhaps both lives are equally real. Perhaps the choice isn't between truth and illusion, but between two valid paths." Before Marcus could respond, a high-pitched whine cut through the night air, making them both sit up. Far above, a light moved across the sky, too regular, too purposeful to be a shooting star. A scout ship, Marcus said, his military training immediately recognizing the pattern. They're scanning for my beacon. The reality of the situation crashed down upon him like a physical weight. Someone had heard his distress call. Rescue was coming, perhaps within hours rather than days. They'll establish orbit, then send down a retrieval team, he explained, his voice hollow. Standard procedure. Talia said nothing, but her fingers intertwined with his, squeezing gently. The question hung unspoken between them, would he go, return to his life among the stars? Or would he stay, embrace this new existence, this echo of another life that grew stronger by the day? As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Marcus stared at the communication device in his hand. One signal to confirm his position, and the retrieval team would find him. One signal to remain silent, and they might eventually give up, assume his beacon had been a malfunction or that he had perished. The soldier in him knew his duty. The man he was becoming knew only that the thought of leaving Talia felt like tearing out a piece of his soul. What will you do? Talia asked finally, her voice steady despite the emotion Marcus could see swimming in her silver eyes. Marcus looked out at the alien landscape that somehow felt more like home than any military barracks ever had. Then he looked at the communication device, the last tether to his former life. His finger hovered over the transmit button as the sun crested the horizon. The scout ship maintained orbit for 3 days. Each night, Marcus watched its lights track across Lysaria's sky, a silent sentinel searching for signs of life. Each morning, he woke beside Talia, her copper skin warm against his, and the silence of his communication device grew heavier. On the 4th day, the ship was gone. They've left, Marcus said, lowering the binoculars he'd salvaged from his crashed vessel. He stood at the edge of the settlement, Talia by his side. And you let them go, she observed, her voice careful, measured. Why? It wasn't a simple question, and Marcus knew it deserved more than a simple answer. They walked together to the riverbank, where the bioluminescent algae drifted in slow currents beneath the surface. The lumen danced around them, their blue light pulsing in greeting. When I first crashed here, Marcus began, I had one identity, one purpose. Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, Orion Fleet. My mission was to get back to that life, that duty. He picked up a stone, turning it over in his hands. But each day here, each night, I've felt Ren's memories becoming more real, more mine. And now? Talia asked. Marcus skipped the stone across the glowing water, watching it bounce 5 times before sinking beneath the surface. Now I understand that I'm neither just Marcus nor just Ren. I'm something new, a convergence. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. The Lysari understand what humans are only beginning to grasp, that consciousness isn't confined to one vessel, one timeline. Ren didn't die in the outer wilds, part of him found his way back to you, through me. Talia's silver eyes shimmered with unshed tears. The elders speak of such things, but even among my people, it is rare to witness. Last night, I dreamed of Ren's final moments, Marcus said quietly. He was exploring a cave system when the ground collapsed. His last thought was of you, a fierce wish to return, to keep his promise. He touched the crystal pendant that now hung around his neck. I think that wish was powerful enough to echo across the stars, to find me, his counterpart in another life, and draw me here. So you're staying, Talia said, her voice catching slightly. Not a question anymore, but a confirmation. I'm staying, Marcus nodded. But not as Ren or as Lieutenant Daniels. I need to find out who I am now, who we can be together. The kiss they shared by the river was a promise, a beginning rather than an end. In the weeks that followed, Marcus formally presented himself to the Lysari Council of Elders. Norin, with his clouded silver eyes, performed the ancient ritual of recognition, acknowledging that while Marcus carried Ren's echo soul, he was still his own being, deserving of his own identity within the community. Two rivers joining to form a new course, the old elder pronounced, pressing his palms to Marcus's temples one final time. Both waters remain, yet create something never before seen. Life settled into rhythms both strange and familiar. Marcus brought his military knowledge to the Lasari, teaching them defensive strategies to protect their hidden world should other humans eventually find them. In return, they taught him to communicate with the Lumen, to harvest crystal fruits from the highest branches, to sing the sacred songs that kept the forests healthy. And Talia taught him how to love without reservation, without the constraints his military life had imposed. In her arms, he found a freedom he had never known possible. One evening, 6 months after the scout ship departed, Marcus stood with Talia on the Ascension Cliffs, watching all three of Lasaria's suns set in succession. They had just completed the joining ceremony, binding their lives together in the Lasari tradition. The settlement below was preparing a celebration that would last until dawn. "Do you ever regret it?" Talia asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "Not returning to your world?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I wonder about my former crew, if they mourned me. But no, I don't regret staying." He turned to face her, his hands cradling her face. "How could I regret finding myself, my whole self, for the first time?" "And who is that self?" she asked with a smile, reaching up to trace the lines of his face, a face that had grown more relaxed, less angular with time on Lasaria. "I am Marcus, who carries Ren within him," he answered. "I am a soldier who learned to be a healer, an explorer who found his way home by getting lost." He pressed his forehead to hers in the intimate Lasari gesture of connection. "I am yours, as I have been across lives." Later that night, as they made love beneath Lasaria's twin moons, Marcus felt the final barriers within him dissolve. The memories of two lives, one lived in the cold vacuum of space, one lived in the warm embrace of this hidden world, flowed together like tributaries joining a river. Neither overcoming the other, both essential to who he had become. In the aftermath, as Talia slept beside him, Marcus gazed up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Orion fleet continued its mission without Lieutenant Daniels. Perhaps, in some distant future, they would find Lasaria, and he would serve as a bridge between two worlds. But for now, he was content to be a man called by two names, living one life rich enough to encompass both. His hand found Talia's in the darkness, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. The lumen gathered around them, pulsing with gentle blue light, as if blessing the convergence of souls that had defied the vast emptiness of space to find each other once again.